Once there were two countries who lived peacefully side by side. Both countries were prosperous, for the crops were plentiful, the sheep and cows were fat, and the rain and seed were abundant. In Shepland, to the north, there were many pastures full of sheep and cows. Shepland had many dairy farms and factories where wool was spun into thread and woven into articles of clothing. Vinland, to the south, had rich soils, and many grains and vegetables were grown there. In late summer, great fairs were held all along the border where the farmers, shepherds, weavers, millers, and residents of the two countries would meet for celebration and for trade. When the time came for the summer fairs, the leaders of both countries would begin to worry. The police and armies would begin to ready themselves, and the soldiers were dispatched from the command of both leaders toward the borderlands where the fairs were to be held. What was there to worry about? There was an abundance of food and clothing. All of the people of both regions had comfortable dwellings and were not in want. And usually the first days of the week-long fair were filled with song and dance and cheer. But often, by the third or fourth day, arguments would break out, followed by disputes, and then two groups would be led into grappling with one another until fights broke out. Once the fight started, the soldiers from both sides would rush in to try to contain the violence, for if the small fights were not ended right away, the mood would begin to infect the entire festival. What began as festivity would end in disaster, for the people would become riotous mobs. Fires would break out, carts and wagons would be overturned, booths where farmers, weavers, cheesemakers, and others sold their wares would be torn apart and all their goods trampled and destroyed. How did it come to be like this? For most of the people from Vinland and Shepland were content with their lives and known for their kindness and generosity. They came to the fair in good spirits, happy with the harvest of their crops, or their fine bundles of wool and yarn they brought. Merrymaking filled the air for a few days until Bartleby arrived. Bartleby was the day following the first night of the full moon. It usually occurred on the third or fourth day of the fair. On Bartleby, the trading began, and that was when the trouble would start. A tailor might walk into the booth of a cloth merchant and ask for a yard of fabric. In Vineland, a yard was as long as a cord that would wrap around the belly of a large man. In Shepland, they used a thin man's waist to measure a yard. The baskets used to measure a share of grain were different from one booth to the next, so that it was impossible to compare prices for grains. A roll of 60 yards of yarn might be long or short depending on where it was made. A pig could not be priced by weight because one farmer had a different way of deciding weight than another. The two countries even used different money, so merchants and buyers alike were constantly accused of cheating each other. In one particularly bad argument over the length of a time a certain candle was said to burn, a fire broke out, which quickly spread from one stall to the next. The Vinlanders had brought with them a huge tanks of water, but only a single hose. "Look here," shouted a merchant from Shepland. "We brought many hoses." Soon Vinlander and Shetlander were working side by side to hook up the hoses, but as the people tried to attach one hose and then another to the water tanks, they realized they had a problem. A big problem. The hoses from Shetland had a different fitting than those used in Vinland, so they could not attach the hoses to the water tanks. The men and women of Vinland stood side by side with the women and men of Shetland. They all watched, hoses in hand, beside full tanks of water, as the fire spread through the entire fair, burning down one booth after another. When the ashes of the fair had cooled, the leaders of the two lands came together in a great council to resolve the problem. It was agreed that there must be standards in all domains of measure. But what was most important to resolve first? The length of things or the measure of weight? The council discussed this for many days and could not reach a decision between nations would be established. But there was another problem for the Council of the Two Lands, which delayed the solution. The council sessions would begin in the morning, but often many would arrive late, and this would delay the discussion. Many points that had already been made in the early morning had to be discussed again for the benefit of the members who were not in attendance. When the sun rose overhead, many of the council members from Shetland would leave for lunch. "Where are all of you going?" the members of Vinland would shout. The Shetlanders would then answer, "You foolish Vinlanders, can you not see for yourselves that the sun is 7 fingers high? In Shetland, that is time for the midday meal. Besides, you Vinlanders always arrive late for the council when it's already 3 fingers in the morning." But then the Vinlanders would protest, "You Shetlanders do not know how to tell time. Anyone can see that the sun is only 3 elbows along. The midday meal doesn't begin until 4 elbows. Of course, this sort of thing went on for several days, one group ending the session before the other. After all, they had been there earlier. What we would call taking a 15-minute break was an impossibility. One group measured the minutes in dingles. They called the little increments of time dingles because their measuring device, which looked like an hourglass filled with tiny marbles, would make a little sound, a dingle, each time one of the marbles dropped. The other group measured the small increments of time in shakies. They used a glass bottle with an extremely thin neck so that only the tiniest amount of sand could escape. The bottle was full of sand. Someone would shake the bottle held upside down. When the bottle was finally emptied, 10 shakies had elapsed. There were larger problems than this, however. Shetlanders measured the year by the sun. During the hot time of the year, the length of daylight would be at its longest, and the high noon sun would be directly overhead. When this time came again, the Shetlanders would say that 1 year had passed. But in Vinland, the people counted the passing of the moon. Each time the full moon returned, they would say that a month had been completed. The Vinlanders considered 12 months to be a complete year. Anyone who knows about the cycles of the moon is aware that the passing of 12 moons makes a year that is only a little over 354 days long, whereas the counting of the days from summer solstice to summer solstice equals a year with 365 and a little bit days. The council found it had to agree on the meeting time for the following year. In addition to this, the transportation schedule for ferries across the river and for ships that set sail to other lands was haphazard. One might wait an entire week to ship goods from Shetland with a cargo ready at the dock, waiting simply because the captain followed the Vinland calendar, while the manufacturer of the goods followed a Shetland calendar. After a frustrating week, the council decided that before they could decide on lengths, they would have to decide on the measure of time.